Good afternoon, everyone. Molweni, goeiemiddag. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University this afternoon at this very special conference commemorating the life and times of Neville Alexander. My name is Denise Zinn. I am the Dean of Education at the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University, and I have the role of just facilitating proceedings, making sure that we get you out here when it is time for you to go and for people to move into their different responsibilities and discussions as time needs them to do so. One of the things I've been asked to say is that in the spirit of Neville Alexander, we are not using what I think he called honorifics. No titles, no special accord is given to anyone present here today. We see everybody being able to engage in discussion and debates as equals, so you will notice on the program that there are no official titles, and anyone who does wish for those to be known may make them known when we are socializing. For now, it is my great pleasure to invite Derrick Swartz, our Vice-Chancellor, to come up to the podium to do the official welcome and opening of this conference. As he comes up, I will just mention that Derrick Swartz is a comrade. He studied at UWC in the 80s, was an activist. He was the Secretary General of the United Democratic Front. After going to the UK to study at Essex University, he returned in the 90s and was the founding director of the Fort Hare Institute of Government, after which he went on to become the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Fort Hare, and since 2008 has been the Vice-Chancellor of the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. Derrick?
Good afternoon. Goeiemiddag, Molweni. I don't know if this audience is made up of people from political organizations, student formations, people from civil society, academics, scholars, members of the professoriate here from NMMU. There may be people from outside of the country, so I'm not so sure in what spirit do I greet you. Amandla. Should I say that? Yes, Amandla. Where to? Welcome everyone to this opening of our colloquium on the life and times of Dr. Neville Alexander, a liberation fighter, stalwart, a Democrat, socialist, a revolutionary, a man with many different dimensions and who really lived a full life. And I'm deeply honored to be able to welcome all of you here, and for the university, NMMU, to be able to host this important colloquium over the next 2.5 days. I think it's until the middle of Monday next week as well. I hope you're going to feel all welcome. We brought up the best weather for you. It's going to get cold, but hopefully the debates and the discussions will heat you up in a good spirit that I think Neville would have wanted us to talk about very important issues regarding not just the future of our country, but also that of the world and the place for a more equal society out there as well. It's also a privilege for me to have the Center for the Study of Non-Racialism and Democracy, CANRAD, to host this conference. The idea actually was germinated when we were holding a tribute to a memoriam to Neville last year. I think it was in September, I can't remember, Alan. And a number of colleagues said, perhaps what we should do, in fact, sorry, the idea came about before the passing away of Neville, when he fell ill, and we heard first about that. And so the idea was discussed by a number of colleagues. And I really have to pay homage and thanks to the generators of this idea, Alan Zinn in particular, who is the head of CANRAD, the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racism and Democracy, Enver Motala, Salim Valley, Crane Sudeen, and a number of other colleagues who worked together behind the scenes to pull together this almost 6-7 months after the first conception of the idea. And so thank you very much for your work in bringing this group together. We also chose CANRAD because Neville was an exponent of non-racialism and democracy, and he held steadfast to this idea from at least his mature youth, from the days when he was at UCT, and certainly throughout his life until the end. He held on and promoted and advocated vigorously the idea of a non-racial society, to debase this false conception or this biological notion that became the basis of a divided society, race, as a principle of organization of any future society as well. But we connect that also to a thesis on radical democracy, that you cannot achieve a non-racial society unless you also tackle issues not just of formal political and social democracy, but also economic democracy, also to radically transform and alter the relations of domination and exploitation that are very much inherent in the nature of capitalism, and it incongruous, therefore, to sustain an idea of democracy and you retain a social and economic order that perpetuates and reinforces constantly new forms of inequality, class inequality as well. And so CANRAD is conceived on this notion that we have to pursue the struggle for a non-racial democracy, but in doing so, it is based on the premise of deepening the radical roots of democracy, read not only in its narrow constitutional political sense, but also in its social and economic senses as well. And I think that dovetails very much with the work that's been done by Neville during the course of his life as well. Now, the title is The Life and Times of Neville Alexander, and I mean, there are a number of young people here who may not know, and some of you of course, may have known him quite well, members of family here that I will acknowledge also later on. Just biographically, he was born on the 22nd of October 1936 in Cradock, which is about 2.5–3 hours from here. It's a very famous place, cradle of struggle, of African nationalism, of militism, and so on, in the 1940s, 50s, and so on. He was born in 1936, and he grew up in the Eastern Cape. Of 6 children, from Dimbiti Bisho Alexander, who was a primary school teacher, and father David James Alexander, who was a carpenter as well. And his family played, according to his own biographical narrative, an important formative role in shaping his ideas of social justice. And many of us can recall the influence of our parents, at least in the communities that we come from, about fundamental notions of equality, of justice, and so on, often spawned through the, religion, in his case, of course, Catholicism, which became an important, doctrine in his early phase of his life as well. He discovered afterwards, when he was on Robben Island, that his grandmother was, in fact, and some of his roots, maternal roots, were in East Africa, in Ethiopia. His grandmother, Piso Jarsa, was actually a slave. The story goes that a slave ship was intercepted off the coast of Yemen, the Arabian Peninsula, by the British, and then the slaves were taken off the ship, and many of them were offloaded in Southern Africa, in South Africa in particular, and his grandmother, Biso Jarsa, was actually an ex-slave that was freed, by the British, and she then resided in Cradock. And so his own journey later in his life to discover his own African roots, not just genetically, but also in terms of history and his social and political roots of the liberation narrative, in a sense, had this interesting personal or biographical connection as well. He didn't know this, as I said, when he went to Robben Island, or not the details there, obviously afterwards as well. He studied, at the Holy Rosary Convent in Cradock, and I can tell you a lot of revolutionaries that became Marxists and atheists and agnostics and so on have their roots in religion of one form or the other as well. If you read, Latin American liberation theology, for example, there's great confluence between Marxist thinking, and also Catholicism, radical Catholicism. And I see some of the radical Catholics here, like Lorraine and others sitting in the audience listening very careful how I'm constructing this narrative as well. But I'm going to be living in peace here, carefully tiptoe over this, and simply to say that there was a profound influence on Neville's life and his ideas about social justice and democracy and so on, that led him, I guess, like many of us, into the journey of becoming a revolutionary and becoming eventually a socialist and a Marxist as well. But you can really divide his life, besides his youth, in probably 4 to 5 stages as well. By 1953, he left Krarok after completing his high school education, in which he was steeped in German by Catholic nuns and so on, and went to the UCT. He initially wanted to study at Fort Hare, but he got admission to study in the arts. He did a Bachelor of Arts and then a Master's subsequent to that at UCT. It was really here at UCT that Neville's theoretical and ideological justifications and rationale for his questioning ideas about the world were inculcated and given sort of clarity of expression and so on. He majored in German and history. He's always had a love. He spoke German fluently. And within 6 months from home, he became a religious doubter and an agnostic, and that eventually morphed into becoming not just a radical socialist, but also an atheist, probably, in the middle of the 1950s when he was at university as well. But he's always retained a respect for not just Christianity, but for the fundamental tenets of all religions who postulate notions of radical equality and social justice and democracy. And these are not antithetical to Marxist beliefs, because it's also a product of modernity, as you know, as an intellectual project, Marxism itself. And so in that sense, it was an alliance. And Neville always used to remind audiences, I remember him speaking in the late 70s and early 80s in Cape Town to us. I was a young student then, a university student, reminding us about the fact that it's actually a radical Christian doctrine, and it's not only Marxism that pontificates about or advocates about these radical ideas as well. He was profoundly influenced during this period, like many of his generation, by the non-European Unity Movement, NUM. It was established in 1943, and the Teachers League of South Africa, TLSA, I think you saw some images of them earlier on here as well, with the doctrines of non-collaboration, non-racialism, and so on as well. And that really was the beginning of his political education in a structured political way as well. He became disenchanted afterwards with this and broke away, but was influenced during this time with Marxist literature, Marx himself, Engels, Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, Ernest Mandel. I remember him quoting that a lot, Isaac Deutscher, the prophet armed, disarmed, and so on. So these were the sort of fundamental writers on Marxism and of that period that influenced his generation as well. He completed his honors and his master's at UCT. His master's thesis was on Baroque drama, of all things. A Marxist revolutionary wrote on Baroque drama, of all things. And that, of course, gave him an interest in literature, and he won the Alexander von Humboldt scholarship, very prestigious scholarship. Left the country to study in Tübingen University in Germany, then was West Germany as well, where he did a PhD, and further focusing on German literature. In fact, as I said, he's always had a passion for the German classics. I think there was a short clip of that. Whilst he was in Paris, he met the late Leon Trotsky's wife. I think it's Natalia Sedova, I think that's her name. I think that was the second wife, as my very shoddy recollection of history recalls, just before she passed away. And it was an encounter that also helped him to firm up his own critique of Stalinism, which was the dominant orthodox variant of Marxism, as you know, in the post-war period as well, and became a trenchant critique of Stalinist doctrine and the Soviet Union as a political manifestation of that doctrine itself. And he embraced Trotsky's ideas about the permanent revolution and so on. He returned after his PhD, and just before, during this time was, of course, in the 1950s and early 60s. It was, the time when there was real revolution, social revolution amongst young people in Europe, in Paris, 1968, of course, much later. And he vowed, apparently, and I'm sure his family can attest, that he would not get married because he would not be able to take care of his family, and he would probably end up in prison. Now, I can tell you for sure, if a hell of a lot of us had decided that, half of our population who had been in prison, we would have had a problem today of reproduction, wouldn't we, if we had that. So I'm glad no one, well, a few of us followed Neville's example in that regard by not getting married as well. But he was prophetic, because in the second phase of his life, he came back to South Africa in 1961. And in 1960, of course, there was this terrible Sharpeville massacre, where 69 people were killed, shot down during the PSC-led uprising, and massive repression of political movements, the banning of political organizations a year after that as well. And Neville came back with, in the context of that era as well, and began to consider the possibility of guerrilla warfare as a serious extension of his political doctrine itself. He was suspended from the unity movement during that period, apparently, Enver, for having raised this and differences about the tactics and strategies of struggle. I think Enver gave me a sense of that a few years ago. He probably can't remember that period. And along with other activists, Marcus Solomons, I think, Kenneth Abrams and so on, Kenneth and Tilly Abrams from the SWAPO Youth Wing, formed this rather exotically named organization called the Yuchi Chan Club. I must admit, I laughed a bit at this the first time I read about it. It's quite an exotic name. I thought, my word, why didn't you call it like something like Umkontowe Sizwe or Potkoho, something, What did you have to do? But apparently that means, in Mandarin, it means guerrilla warfare, armed struggle. So they chose this name. They formed this group, a vanguardist group. They eventually caught. He laughed about it afterwards. I had an informal conversation with him, and I was curious. I said, where did you guys come up with this name? Couldn't you think of a more indigenous name of this as well? He said, no, this is just a term that we use. And we were young, and we were experimenting and so on. We were reckless. We were heavily infiltrated by the regime at the time as well, informers and so on. And eventually we got caught out. And so on. But this is an era when they were experimenting with forms of accelerating not just the pace but the intensity of political struggle, because the regime was repressive, and the choices were the legal grounds on which struggles were conducted in the 1950s up until that were being closed by the regime effectively as well. And so there were limited options during that period. And I guess Neville was part of those first generations of people. I think there were the National Liberation Front as well, of course, from Umkhonto we Potko, and a couple of other offshoots as well during that period, most of whom were crushed during that period. Nonetheless, he was teaching at this period, and then eventually they were caught, and because they were infiltrated, detained, charged, and eventually convicted and sentenced to Robben Island for 10 years. From about 1964 till 1974, he was taken out, literally, from South Africa. With others, Fikile Bam, I think, was part of that group, Marcus Solomon, as I mentioned earlier, Kenneth Abrams, and so on, all sentenced, and then they joined the other groups that were on the island. Of course, 1962 already was the first PAC group, and then the Mandela group came in 1964, and of course there was a whole confluence of liberation fighters or political activists that were now thrown together on the island as well. And he speaks very movingly. I saw him on film, and I read also about it, and also just informally about this. Although it was a hard period in the first part of the 1960s, from about 65, 66, when they battled for political rights in prison, limited as it were, they succeeded in gaining certain freedoms and so on, to study and so on, and they also became much more confident. It was also in that period that it became, for him and many others, what he called an ennobling and enriching experience to work with comrades like Mandela, Sisulu, Mbeki, and so on as well. And they could have these inter-organizational conversations and debates that became the stuff of legend or folklore many years after that as well. I remember when I was a student, people used to gossip a lot about the 2-year debate Neville had with Madiba on the island. I'm not so sure. Crane, you the historian, whether it was 2 years or 1 month or 2 months, but there was this legendary debate or debates on the national question, one of them as well, with Madiba and others as well, that Neville apparently had. I don't know, maybe Enver and colleagues can cast light on that. But Robben Island was effectively becoming a cauldron of intellectual activity, a university, so to speak, and he speaks about this in one of his quotations as well. He said, we didn't need professors, university professors, we studied history, we look at alternative economics, we grappled with the problems of capitalist development and its historical specificities in South Africa and so on. We looked at the theory and strategies of guerrilla warfare and insurrection. We looked at the Vietnam experience. We looked at the Cuban experience and so on as well. And we tried to learn lessons, the Algerian question and so on. So there were really deep-seated debates on the island amongst them as well. And it would have been a wonderful experience to be a fly on the wall, to have been witness to that history. And I don't think it has actually been written up. I guess Crane, I can't see where's Crane sitting here. Crane sitting here, yeah. A lot of that has not yet been written or recorded, or many of the dimensions of that history as well. And so it'd be a very interesting project. If some of my students are sitting here in history and literature and so on, sociology, those would be very interesting topics to research on as well, and probably before the rest of that generation passes on as well. He also mentions that how he learned about his own personality and his own temperament and limitations as an activist. He said, look, I was a radical, and I believed I was a trenchant critique of the Congress tradition, and I still remain that. But I also learned under those circumstances, that intense laboratory of people were sitting together on the island, that I needed to respect other views. And I can learn from my opponents. They're not my enemies, they're my opponents. And hopefully they can also learn from me as well. And that really also helped him in his later life as well. Because I remember Neville, and I'm sure many of you know him much better and well, as someone who tolerated the idea of difference and debate and critique. And none of his own positions were beyond critical introspection as well. And I hope that that's the kind of the mantra, the lens through which we will frame the next 2.5 days as well. It's not a hagiographical, praise singing, although there are obviously things to celebrate and to commend about him as well. But I think Neville was a political activist and used science to critique society as well, and rational, discourse to dispute, different conceptions about reality and how that reality can be altered and so on. And I hope we will not be doctrinal or dogmatic in the way that we will, frame the issues that will come up when we think about the life and the times of Neville as well. I think that will be a great way to celebrate his critical spirit as well. From 1974, he was released after the 10 years. He was placed under banning order immediately by the regime for almost a decade, I believe. And house arrest also for that first period. It was almost 10 years, I think, as well. And during that period, it obviously gave him some scope to do some political writings, where his first book in 1979 came out, One Azania, One Nation, No Sizwe. I remember my copy got confiscated by the regime, and I tried to claim it back years after that, but people just ignored me. I don't know what happened to all the banned literature, guys. Huh? I mean, they confiscated vast amounts of our literature, and I tried in vain, Dr. Jordan, in vain with some of our ministers, and I don't know, it just could never get the stuff, because a lot of valuable documents that I remember from that period, that unfortunately I don't actually know the sources of those documents too. From Philippines, from Chile, struggles in Algeria and so on. And it's a pity that we could never, hopefully we can get it in public libraries and we can have access to that. I mean, I don't want it personal property, but I would like that to be available to new generations of people to research and to think through as well. Of course, Neville came back in the 1970s. It was the era of the Black Consciousness Movement, BCM. And there's famous stories, difficult stories about Steve Biko visiting him and wanting to meet with him in Cape Town. They couldn't meet. And there's a part where Neville says that he regrets that he did not meet with Steve during that period because of a number of circumstances that I think are still being speculated about, to security and so on during that period. But Neville certainly, spent a great deal of time in stitching alliances, with the Black consciousness tradition, because he believed in the idea that culture is very much part of the political traditions of liberation itself, that you cannot talk about liberation without also culture. And people's sense of identity, sense of disempowerment starts in their own ideas about themselves, and how colonial domination and apartheid, racist oppression had become institutionalized in the mind as a construct, so to speak. And BC, the Black Consciousness Movement and ideology was a courageous and a brave refutation of the idea of white domination and black inferiority as well. And so Neville really took that to heart as well, and formed alliances in the latter part of his life, also in the 1980s and 90s, also with the National Forum and so on, in forging alliances with AZAPO, which the successor movements from the BC movement of the 1970s as well. Neville was very critical of, well, as I said earlier on, he broke away from the unity movement, disagreed with what he considered to be sterile politics, armchair politics, and he felt that you needed to go further than be critical and non-collaborationist. You needed actually to force the pace of militancy of the struggle itself. But he was even more critical of the Charterist position, led by the ANC and the Alliance, in the 1950s and 60s as well. And particularly critical, as I'm sure it will come up in debates here as well, about, the idea of nationhood and the national question, which I think is a subject of tonight's discussions as well. So I will not go into that as well. But Neville really explored this in his writings, political as well as to some extent theoretical notions of what constitutes nation states and national identities. And are we a single nation? Are we an aspirant nation? Are there different national groups? He was very critical of what he called the four-nation thesis, proposed and propagated, in his view, by segments of the Charterist movement in the 1950s and so on as well. But also issues of how the struggle against racism and apartheid is linked to the deeper struggle against capitalist exploitation and economic domination itself as well. And the two could not, in his view, be separated historically if the quest is a more fundamentally equal society in future as well. During this period, when his banning orders were lifted from him, he started also to work at UCT again in sociology, and he began to experiment with setting up institutions. The issue of culture and language were then becoming much more pronounced, as I hinted earlier on as well. And he was a firm believer right from the beginning, the idea of a multilingual society, and mother tongue instruction is an important part of having a successful democracy, and it's the worst form of cultural imperialism to have only English as the only lingua franca, the only language through which society learns about itself and governs its affairs, not just in scholarly activity, but also daily life and state administration, economic transactions, and so on as well. And he wrote extensively and passionately about this. The last few days I've been going over some of his works on that, and I've really been struck at the breadth and the depth of Neville's research and explorations of questions of culture and domination, and of course influenced by Frans Fanon in Algeria, Amilcar Cabral in Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, a whole range of other cultural activists and writers that influenced him, and of course he also in turn influenced some of them as well. From the 1990s, when these banning orders were obviously stripped off and the political space had opened up, Neville became involved with the establishment of WASA, a workers' organization for socialist action, initially in Cape Town, then became a national movement. PRAISA, I think we have an exhibition of the work of Neville on that. He also established or helped to establish Kanya College, and worked there. And many of his proteges are probably here in the audience as well, who worked under him and influenced their thinking, as my own, of course, as well. On this, Neville not only influenced people inside the organizations in which he moved in. I remember when I was in the student movement, also people that were not part of, I wasn't part of Neville's political movement, but my thinking and my critique of the nature of domination and oppression and alternatives there too. Theories of apartheid and racial capitalism and so on were influenced by Neville's critique of my own positions that I held, and I'm sure a number of people in the Congress movement left, I think, certainly would say that, certainly in Cape Town, where I grew up as well. So it had a radicalizing impact on many of us, and I still hold dear to those beliefs that you cannot separate those two struggles and so on. Although there's a historical specificity about racism and apartheid, they are dialectically interconnected in the way that capitalism has historically evolved and morphed and mutated, through various decades. But that's not my area of competence tonight to speak to, simply to say that I think Neville really explored this in very interesting ways. He wasn't always right about that, and certainly political practice can always be critiqued as well, but I hope that we will see this as an interesting, rich platform for discussion and debate as well. He passed away tragically at the age of 76 on the 27th of August last year, and it is a huge loss to not just the political organizations that he and people that he represented in a narrow sense, but to the country and to the continent as well. He was very active on the continent in multilingual movements, language movements across the continent. On the AU, for example, he played a critical role in the last decade of his life. He also wasn't just a critic of the system. He played a role also advocating alternative positions, which I really admired about him, and experimenting with alternative notions of education, for example, language practice, on curriculum transformation at a pre-secondary school level, particularly the basic level as well. Neville played a huge role in not just theorizing about that and being an activist and an agitator about changing these things. He actually used the spaces that were available in the 1980s, especially the last part of the 1980s and certainly in the 90s, to create new instruments, to explore alternatives in radical democracy, to give people a stake in their own lives, a sense of control, a sense of historical agency over that. And so to that extent, I think Neville was an extraordinary man. He wasn't just a revolutionary in a sense of agitating against something. He was also someone that had built new institutional forms in the country. Now, of course, I speculate privately in my mind, what if the National Forum won the elections? Let's dream on, in 1994, 95, Crane. You remember when they entered the elections, how would Neville have dealt with the contradictions of a huge compromise that was made by, with the de Klerk regime during that period, with the sunset clauses on property, for example, and so on. How would he have dealt with that system? I mean, that's an interesting hypothesis to think about as well. But I think he was really an extraordinary individual. And had it been given a, scope at a level of state policy development, I'm sure we would have seen legacies far beyond what he's been able to establish on the ground. But because he wasn't in political power, that did not deter him from experimenting and promoting and advocating and building a new future as well. And that's really, I guess, another message that I would like to bring out, that even though we are not in the government, in the state, and so on. And we may have many differences with state policy and state practice in many instances. There's sufficient space to build, democratic forms of power and alternatives on the ground as well. And I hope that we will be daring in that regard, and we will not be deterred, by anyone on building that future as well. Neville's own writings had straddled issues from the characterization of the national question and the nature of the liberation struggle, the intersection between race and class, and in terms of its institutional and social manifestations, the relationship between apartheid and capitalism, how that intermeshed and intersected and also mutated over the different epochs as well. He grappled with this issue before 95-94 and certainly 1995 to up until now. He grappled with that, and he firmly believed, as I said, in the idea that unless we tackle the fundamental inequalities that are steeped and born and generated endemically in the very nature of capitalism, there is little chance to fundamentally alter relations of power in the country, not only just politically in the formal constitutional rights, but also socially and economically as well. And to that extent, it was a radical critique. How he framed that intersection, of course, one can debate. And of course, what ensues from that strategic and tactical decisions that grew from that, the primacy of the working class, for example, the motive forces of the revolution, his own theory of revolutionary change, and how did he frame that? His theory of social transformation, itself. I think there's a lot of debates about going to have. He worked on colonialism, Pan-Africanism, post-colonial struggles, as I said, the role of culture as a critical element of domination. He explored deeply into the issues about education and liberation. In the 1980s, I remember huge cries for education, liberation before education. Neville argued passionately, I remember, with school students in the early 1980s against this notion, say, you cannot give this up. This is your weapon of struggle as well. And he experimented, as I said, in this, also in language, education, access, and social empowerment, racism and education. He really dwelled on this issue, identity, culture, revolutionary practice. And I also believe that latterly, although I don't have evidence of this, he wrote on ethics of revolutionary practice. I know he spoke about ethics of revolutionary practices as well as aesthetics. Crane says in a very interesting paper that I read last night that Crane wrote on Robben Island, was that in 1962, I think, Julius Nyerere had apparently banned beauty contests in his country. And so Madiba then asked Neville on the island to write a theory on beauty. So I would love to, if that was done. I mean, the only few things I wrote is about Umberto Eco and others on a critique of notions of Western beauty and so on. So that would be interesting, Crane, if you can dig up further evidence on that. Really, finally, to say, colleagues, I must also just welcome colleagues from Cape Town, family members. These are the only exceptions, Denise, I will make. Members of Neville's family, 4 of whom traveled from Cape Town by road, and really a special welcome to you. I'll mention them just by name and maybe just ask you to stand, just to turn to the audience if you are here. Frederick Alexander, his brother. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. Jeanette Masala, his sister. Michael Masala, brother-in-law. Michael. Myrtle Karim, his sister. And then his cousin, whom I think is from Port Elizabeth, Cynthia Clark. Thank you very much. And just finally, that his partner, Karen Press, will be joining us, I think, tomorrow morning. Thank you very much, colleagues. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thanks.